The Vethari hit Kepler 22b like a hammer hitting glass. 12 capital ships dropped out of faster-than-light travel directly above the colony and began raining plasma fire on the surface before the colonists even had time to sound the alarms. The sky turned orange. Buildings melted. Streets that had been full of people minutes earlier became rivers of fire and broken stone. Governor Tina Brooks was in her office when the first shots landed. The ceiling cracked above her head, and dust poured down like rain. She did not scream. She did not freeze. She grabbed the emergency communicator from her desk and issued the order she had prayed she would never have to give. All civilians were to move to the deep bunkers immediately. No exceptions, no delays. Take nothing, just move. Tina was not a soldier. She was an administrator, a woman who had spent her career managing water systems, food supplies, and construction schedules. But she had survived a decompression event on Mars that killed 30 people around her, and she had lived through a famine year on Proxima, where she had to decide who ate and who did not. She knew how to stay calm when the world was ending. The deep bunkers had been carved into the bedrock beneath the colony during its founding, back when the engineers were not sure if the planet's geology was stable. They were meant to hold 10,000 people for up to 6 months. Tina was about to find out if that estimate was accurate. While the civilians moved underground, Colonel Hank Lawson rallied his garrison. Hank was a broad-shouldered man with a shaved head and a voice that carried across a battlefield without any amplification. He had 2,000 Marines, a handful of automated gun platforms, and a network of tunnels and maintenance shafts that connected every part of the colony underground. He had no air support, no orbital defenses, and no idea when or if reinforcements would come. The Vethari landed their first wave of ground troops within hours of the bombardment. Dropships came down in clusters, each one carrying 100 Vethari shock troops in full battle armor. They poured out onto the scorched surface of the colony, expecting to find rubble and survivors begging for mercy. Instead, they found Sergeant Joe Briggs and his squad waiting for them. Joe was a thin, quiet man with steady hands and a talent for making things explode. He had spent the hours since the first bombardment rigging 3 entire city blocks with improvised explosives made from mining charges, fuel cells, and anything else his team could find. When the first Vethari column marched through the ruins of the colony's market district, Joe triggered the charges. The blast killed over 60 Vethari soldiers in a single moment. Before the smoke cleared, Joe and his 12 Marines opened fire from concealed positions, cut down another 20, and then disappeared into the maintenance tunnels before the Vethari could respond. This became the pattern of the siege. The Vethari would advance, and the humans would let them come. They would funnel the Vethari into narrow streets, collapsed buildings, and underground corridors where the aliens' size and heavy armor became weaknesses instead of strengths. Then the humans would hit them hard, fast, and from directions they did not expect, and vanish before the Vethari could bring their superior numbers to bear. Hank Lawson ran the defense like a conductor running an orchestra. He moved his squads through the tunnel network constantly, never letting the Vethari pin down any single group. He collapsed tunnels behind advancing Vethari units, trapping them underground. He flooded lower corridors with freezing water from the colony's reservoir, turning entire sections of the underground into death traps for the cold-blooded reptilians, whose bodies slowed and shut down in extreme cold. The Vethari ground commander was a veteran warrior named Warlord Sevik Ran. He had conquered 3 worlds before this one, and had never faced an enemy that gave him this much trouble. His troops were dying in numbers that his models had not predicted. Every building could be a trap. Every shadow could hide a human with a gun. His soldiers were starting to hesitate before entering dark rooms, and hesitation was something the Vethari military did not tolerate. Sevik sent more troops. He sent armored vehicles. He sent heavy weapons teams to level the remaining structures and deny the humans cover. But for every building the Vithari leveled, the humans found new positions. They fought from sewers, from rooftops, from the inside of wrecked vehicles. They set traps using tripwires and pressure plates. They turned the colony's own infrastructure into a weapon, overloading power conduits to create electrical barriers, and venting toxic coolant into corridors where Vithari units were advancing. On the fourth day of the siege, medic Claire Sutton had been working without sleep for over 50 hours. Claire had set up a hospital in one of the deeper bunker levels, using medical supplies that had been stored for emergencies and equipment she had improvised from whatever was available. She had treated plasma burns, crush injuries, shrapnel wounds, and broken bones. She had performed surgery on a folding table under lights powered by a portable generator. She had held the hands of Marines who were not going to make it, and told them they were going to be fine, because that was what they needed to hear. By the 7th day, Joe Briggs had lost half his squad. 6 of the 12 Marines he had started with were dead. He knew their names. He knew their faces. He carried their dog tags in his pocket, and felt them clink against each other with every step. But he did not stop. He could not stop. There were still people in the bunkers below him, civilians and children, who were depending on him and every other Marine to hold the line. Joe adapted. He started recruiting volunteers from among the civilians, people who had no military training, but who refused to sit underground and do nothing while others died for them. He taught them how to set charges, how to fire a weapon, how to move through the tunnels without making noise. They were not soldiers, but they were angry and brave, and that was enough. By the 9th day, Sevik Ram was losing control of the situation. His casualty reports were staggering. He had lost over 4,000 troops, nearly a third of his landing force, and he still did not control the underground. Every attempt to breach the deep bunkers had been repelled. His troops were exhausted, demoralized, and increasingly terrified of an enemy they could not see and could not predict. He sent a message to High Commander Drevik Thal aboard the Crushing Tide, requesting reinforcements. In the message, he wrote something that would later become famous across the galaxy. He wrote, "These creatures do not fight like soldiers. They fight like a disease. We cut them in one place, and they appear in another. We destroy their positions, and they build new ones from the wreckage. I have never seen anything like this. I do not believe we can break them through force alone." Drevik read the message and felt that strange feeling again, the one he could not name. He sent the reinforcements, but for the first time in his long career, he began to wonder if he had made a mistake. On the 11th day of the siege, the Vithari controlled the surface of Kepler 22b. Every building was rubble. Every street was scorched. From orbit, the colony looked dead. But beneath the surface, 2,000 humans were still breathing, still fighting, and still refusing to give up. Claire Sutton had saved over 70 lives. Joe Briggs had destroyed more Vettery equipment than any single unit in the history of the colony. Hank Lawson had held the underground against an enemy that outnumbered him 10-1. And somewhere out in the black, Admiral Danny Cole was coming. The siege was not over. While Kepler 22b was bleeding, Admiral Danny Cole was not sitting still. He knew that he could not save the colony with the 14 ships under his command. He knew that no single human fleet could match the Vithari armada in open battle. But Danny also knew something that the Vithari did not. He knew that humans were never more dangerous than when they were told they could not win. He sent a message on every frequency, to every colony, every outpost, every ship and station in all 14 human star systems. The message was not encrypted. He did not care if the Vithari heard it. He wanted them to hear it. The message said, "This is Admiral Danny Cole of the United Earth Defense Fleet. The Vithari Dominion has attacked the colony on Kepler 22b. Our people are under siege. I am calling on every ship that can fly, every man and woman who can fight, and every person who believes that humanity does not abandon its own, rally at Barnard's Reach. We are going to bring our people home. The response was beyond anything Danny had expected. Captain Karen Walsh arrived first. She commanded a frigate called the Dawn Runner, a mid-sized warship that had already seen more combat in the past week than it had in its entire service life. Karen had fought her way through a Vethari patrol near the Tau Ceti relay station. The battle had cost her the port engine, half her crew, and a chunk of her hull big enough to walk through. When she docked at Barnard's Reach, she stepped off her ship with her left arm in a makeshift sling, and a look on her face that said she was ready for more. Danny met her at the docking bay. He looked at her ship, which was barely holding together, and asked her if the Dawn Runner could still fight. Karen looked at him and said that her ship could fight as long as she could stand, and she was not planning on sitting down anytime soon. Over the next 3 days, ships arrived at Barnard's Reach from every direction. Military vessels came from patrol routes and garrison posts. Armed cargo haulers came from the shipping lanes. Mining ships from the asteroid belt showed up with drilling lasers mounted on their hulls, and crews who had never been in a fight, but who were ready to learn. Civilian transports arrived, carrying volunteers, supplies, and spare parts. Commander Nick Dunn arrived on the second day. Nick was a tactical officer who had been teaching at the Fleet Academy on Luna when the war started. He was not a flashy man. He wore glasses, spoke softly, and looked more like a university professor than a military commander. But Nick had written more than half of the fleet's modern combat manuals, and his mind worked in ways that made other officers uncomfortable, because he saw patterns and possibilities where everyone else saw only problems. Danny brought Nick into the planning sessions immediately. Nick studied the intelligence reports on the Vethari fleet, their formation patterns, their weapon ranges, their communication protocols. He spent 18 hours going through every piece of data they had, and then he sat down with Danny and laid out a plan. He called it the Wolfpack Doctrine. The idea was built on a simple truth. The human fleet could not win a straight fight. If they lined up against the Vethari and traded shots, they would be destroyed. The Vethari ships were bigger, tougher, and hit harder at range. But human ships were faster. Human pilots were more creative. And human crews could handle acceleration forces that would knock a Vethari unconscious or kill them outright. The human body, for all its softness, could endure punishment that most species in the galaxy could not match. Nick's plan was to break the fleet into small groups of 3 to 5 ships, each group operating independently but coordinated through a central command network. These wolf packs would not try to hold a line or defend a position. Instead, they would attack the Vethari formation from every direction at once, hitting weak points, exploiting gaps, and pulling away before the enemy could concentrate fire on them. The goal was not to overpower the Vethari, but to overwhelm them with chaos. Most of the senior officers thought Nick was out of his mind. Sam Perry studied the plan for 2 hours, and then said it was the most reckless thing he had ever seen, but that it was also the only thing that might actually work. Danny approved it. The fleet began organizing into wolf packs. Veteran warship captains were paired with civilian volunteers. Fighter pilots were assigned to fly cover for converted mining ships. Everyone trained together, practiced together, and learned to trust each other in the space of days when they would normally have had months. Pilot Amy Voss was 23 years old and had been running cargo between the Belt colonies since she was 19. She had never fired a weapon in her life. She had never been in a battle. But she could fly. She could fly like she was born in the cockpit, threading her bulky hauler through asteroid fields and debris clouds with a precision that made professional pilots stare. When she volunteered her ship and her skills, the recruitment officer looked at her age and her lack of combat experience and almost turned her away. Then Amy flew a demonstration run, through the station's debris field at speeds that should have been impossible. And the officer assigned her to a wolf pack on the spot. Amy was paired with 2 veteran fighter pilots, a man named Greg Nolan and a woman named Beth Sawyer. Greg was 46 and had been flying combat missions since before Amy was born. Beth was 38 and had a reputation for being ice cold under fire. Neither of them was thrilled about flying alongside a cargo runner with no training, but they watched Amy fly and kept their complaints to themselves. Engineer Pete Garza arrived on the 3rd day aboard a transport from the Proxima colony. Pete was 52 years old, with rough hands, a thick beard, and a mind that never stopped solving problems. He had spent 20 years building colony infrastructure, designing everything from water recycling systems to atmospheric processors. When he heard about the war, he packed his tools and caught the first ship to Barnard's Reach. Pete went straight to the weapons lab and started studying the Vathari shield technology. Human weapons could damage Vathari ships, but the shields absorbed most of the impact, reducing the effectiveness of every missile and every energy blast. Pete realized that the Vathari shields operated on a specific harmonic frequency, and if a missile could be tuned to match that frequency, it would pass through the shield like it was not even there. He built the first prototype in a maintenance bay using spare missile components, a frequency modulator pulled from a communications array, and a welding torch. The prototype worked on the first test, punching through a simulated Vathari shield with no resistance at all. Pete showed the results to Danny and Nick, and within hours, every missile in the fleet was being modified. On the eve of the battle, Danny stood in the main hangar of Barnard's Reach and looked out at his fleet. It was the strangest armada ever assembled. Sleek military frigates floated alongside battered cargo ships. Mining vessels with jury-rigged weapons sat next to patrol boats that had been in service for decades. The crews were just as varied. Career soldiers stood beside farmers, teachers, miners, and shopkeepers. Old veterans shared space with kids who had never left their home systems before last week. Danny spoke to them over the fleet-wide channel. He did not give a long speech. He was not good at long speeches, and he knew these people did not need one. He told them the truth. He told them the odds were bad and that many of them would not come back. He told them that the people of Kepler 22b had been holding out for days against an enemy that should have crushed them in hours, and that those people were waiting for help. He told them that the galaxy was watching to see what humanity would do when faced with impossible odds. Then he said one last thing. He said that he had served in the fleet for 30 years, and he had never been more proud than he was right now, looking out at a bunch of stubborn, brave, ridiculous human beings who had shown up to fight a war they had no business winning. The fleet launched, 209 ships, heading straight for the largest military force the Orion Corridor had ever seen. Amy Voss sat in her cockpit and watched the stars streak past her viewport. Her hands were steady on the controls. Her heart was pounding. Beside her, Greg Nolan's voice came through the radio, calm and easy, telling her to stay on his wing and follow his lead. Behind them, Pete Garza sat in a weapons bay aboard the Steadfast, watching rows of modified missiles being loaded into launch tubes and hoping that his math was right. Ahead of them, 300 Vathari warships waited in the darkness. The fight of humanity's life was about to begin. The Varath Expanse was a vast stretch of empty space between two nebulae, a place where there was nothing but darkness and stars for millions of kilometers in every direction. It was here that High Commander Drevik Thal chose to make his stand. He arranged his fleet in the traditional Vathari battle crescent, a formation that had been used by his people for thousands of years and had never once been broken by an enemy. The crescent was simple and devastating. 8 dreadnoughts formed the center, their massive plasma cannons pointed forward in a wall of firepower that could vaporize anything in its path. Cruisers spread out along the flanks like the curved tips of a blade. Fighter screens flew ahead of the main formation, acting as eyes and shields. Supply ships and troop transports sat safely behind the line, protected by the bulk of the war fleet. Drevik stood on the bridge of the crushing tide, his flagship and the largest dreadnought in the formation. He watched his tactical display and waited for the humans to arrive. He expected them to form their own battle line, because that was what every species he had ever fought had done. They would line up, exchange fire, and be destroyed. That was how war worked. That was how it had always worked. The human fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the expanse, and for a moment, Drevik felt something close to amusement. The human formation was a mess. Ships were scattered across a wide area, with no visible order or structure. There was no battle line, no crescent, no formation of any kind that Drevik could recognize. It looked like a swarm of insects rather than a military fleet. Then the swarm attacked, and Drevik stopped being amused. Commander Nick Dunn sat in the Combat Information Center aboard the Steadfast, surrounded by screens and data feeds, his eyes moving constantly as he tracked the positions of every ship in both fleets. He had spent the entire journey to the Expanse, running simulations, refining the Wolfpack assignments, and drilling the squadron leaders on their attack patterns. Now it was time to see if the theory held up against reality. Nick gave the order, and the Wolfpack struck. 43 groups of ships hit the Vithari formation from every direction at the same time. They came from above, below, and both flanks. They came in fast, fired everything they had, and pulled away before the Vithari guns could track them. Pete Garza's modified missiles streaked through the darkness and passed through Vithari shields like they were not there, slamming into hull plating and detonating against armor that had never been breached before. The Vithari Crescent, designed to focus its firepower on a single enemy line in front of it, could not adapt. Gunners swung their turrets to track one group of human ships, only to find another group attacking from the opposite side. Captains shouted orders that contradicted each other. The beautiful, ancient formation that had crushed 100 enemies began to crack at the edges. Amy Voss was flying with her Wolfpack on the left flank of the battle. Greg Nolan led the group, his fighter cutting through space with the ease of a man who had spent decades in a cockpit. Beth Sawyer flew on the right, her weapons firing in short, precise bursts that hit exactly where they were aimed. Amy flew her cargo hauler between them, and she flew it like nothing the Vithari had ever seen. Their Wolfpack's target was a Vithari cruiser on the outer edge of the crescent. Greg led them in on a steep diving approach, drawing the cruiser's forward guns upward while Beth swung wide and hit it from the side. Amy did something that no trained military pilot would have done. She flew her hauler directly through the gap between the target cruiser and the ship next to it, a space barely wide enough for her vessel to fit through. Both Vithari ships fired at her. Both missed, their plasma bolts crossing in the space she had just occupied and hitting each other instead. Amy came out the other side, looped around, and fired the two missiles mounted on her hauler's belly directly into the cruiser's engine section. The modified warheads punched through the shields and detonated inside the ship. The cruiser's engines blew apart in a chain reaction that split the vessel in half. Greg's voice came over the radio, and for the first time since Amy had met him, the veteran pilot sounded impressed. He told her that was the craziest thing he had ever seen. Amy told him she was just following the opening she saw. Across the battlefield, Captain Karen Walsh was leading the Dawn Runners straight into the heart of the Vithari formation. Her target was the enemy's communication relay ship, a large vessel near the center of the crescent that coordinated signals between all the Vithari fleet elements. Nick Dunn had identified it as the key to the Vithari's ability to fight as a unified force. Without it, their captains would be unable to coordinate, and the formation would collapse. Karen knew the mission was close to suicidal. The relay ship was surrounded by dreadnoughts and cruisers, and getting to it meant flying through the densest concentration of enemy firepower in the entire battle. Her ship was already damaged from the fight near Tau Ceti. Her crew was tired and reduced to less than half strength. She told them the plan. She told them what it would take. She told them that anyone who wanted to leave could do so, and she would think no less of them. Not a single person moved. The Dawnrunner went in at full speed, weaving between Vethari capital ships, taking hits that tore chunks out of her hull and blew open compartments along her port side. Karen held the course. Her weapons officer, a young man named Tony Park, fired everything the ship had at the relay vessel. Missiles, energy weapons, even the point defense guns meant for shooting down incoming fire. He emptied every magazine and every power cell the ship had. The relay ship exploded. Its communication array went dark, and suddenly every Vethari captain in the fleet was alone, cut off from central command and from each other. The effect was immediate. The Crescent, already strained by the Wolfpack attacks, fell apart completely. Vethari ships began acting independently, some pushing forward aggressively, while others tried to pull back. They got in each other's way, blocked firing lines, and created gaps that the human Wolfpacks exploited ruthlessly. Danny Cole watched from the steadfast bridge as the battle turned. He did not celebrate. He could see the cost on his displays. Human ships were dying out there. Bright dots on his screen were disappearing, each one representing a crew, a group of people who would not be going home. But the plan was working. Nick's Wolfpacks were tearing the Vethari fleet apart, piece by piece. Drevik Thal stood on the bridge of the crushing tide and watched his empire's greatest fleet being dismantled by creatures he had dismissed as vermin. His tactical display was a chaos of red warning symbols. Ship after ship reported critical damage or went silent entirely. His communications were fragmented. His formation was gone. For the first time in his life, Drevik Thal tasted defeat, and it tasted like ashes. Every ship was to disengage and fall back to Vethari space immediately. But the Wolfpacks did not let them go. Nick Dunn had planned for this. He knew that a wounded enemy who escaped would come back stronger, and he was not going to let that happen. The Wolfpacks pursued the retreating Vethari ships, picking off stragglers and damaged vessels, herding the survivors into tight groups where they could be hit again and again. By the time the guns fell silent, the Vethari had lost over 80% of their fleet. 240 warships were destroyed or disabled, drifting as burning wreckage in the cold darkness of the expanse. The crushing tide itself had taken heavy damage and barely made it out of the battle zone. The human fleet had paid a terrible price. 67 ships were gone. Thousands of men and women had died in the darkness between the nebulae. Entire Wolfpack groups had been wiped out, but they had won. Karen Walsh was alive. The Dawnrunner was a wreck, drifting without power, but a rescue shuttle found her and her surviving crew clinging to emergency oxygen in the one compartment that still held atmosphere. When the rescue team cut through the hull to reach her, Karen was sitting in her command chair with her broken arm and a calm expression, as if she had been waiting for a bus. Amy Voss brought her battered cargo hauler down on the landing deck of the Steadfast. The ship had a hole burned through its cargo bay, big enough to drive a ground vehicle through, and half its systems were offline. Amy climbed out on legs that would not stop shaking, and stood on the deck for a long moment, just breathing. A reporter who had somehow gotten aboard the carrier asked her how she was feeling. Amy looked at him with exhausted eyes and said she could really use a sandwich. Greg Nolan found her a few minutes later and told her she was the best pilot he had ever flown with. Amy thanked him and then sat down on the deck and cried, because the adrenaline was gone and the reality of what had just happened was hitting her all at once. In the expanse behind them, the wreckage of two fleets drifted slowly through the silence of space, and the galaxy held its breath. The news of what happened in the Varath expanse traveled across the galaxy faster than any ship could fly. Communication relays carried it from system to system, station to station, world to world. Species that had never spoken to humans heard the story. Species that had lived under Vethari rule for centuries heard it and could not believe it. The Vethari Dominion, the oldest and most feared military power in the Orion Corridor, had been broken in a single battle by a species that most of the galaxy still considered young, reckless, and insignificant. The details made it even harder to believe. The humans had been outnumbered. Their ships had been smaller and less powerful. Their fleet had been a patchwork collection of warships, cargo haulers, and mining vessels, held together with emergency welds and stubborn willpower. They should have been destroyed in the first hour. Instead, they had torn the greatest armada in the sector apart. But the battle was only half the story. The other half was happening on the surface of Kepler 22b. When word reached the besieged colony that the Vethari fleet had been destroyed, Colonel Hank Lawson allowed himself to sit down for the first time in days. He sat on an ammunition crate in a tunnel deep underground, put his face in his hands, and stayed like that for a full minute. Nobody bothered him. Everyone understood. Then he stood up, straightened his back, and told his Marines to prepare for the final push to the surface. The Vethari ground forces on Kepler 22b were cut off. Their fleet was gone. Their supply ships were gone. Their communication with high command was gone. Over 6,000 Vethari soldiers were stranded on a world they had failed to conquer, surrounded by an enemy that had held them off for nearly 2 weeks in conditions that should have been impossible. Warlord Sevik Ran gathered his remaining officers and faced the reality of his situation. He had lost nearly half his troops to the siege. His soldiers were exhausted, demoralized, and running low on ammunition and food. The humans still held the underground, and without orbital support, there was no way to crack the deep bunkers. He could keep fighting, but it would be a fight with no purpose, and no end except the death of everyone under his command. Sevik made the decision that no Vethari commander had made in 6,000 years of conquest. He sent a message to the human garrison requesting terms for surrender. Hank Lawson received the message and forwarded it to Admiral Danny Cole, who was already en route to Kepler 22b with the surviving fleet. Danny's response was simple. Accept the surrender. Treat the prisoners with dignity. No reprisals. Sergeant Joe Briggs was the one who walked out onto the surface to meet the Vethari. He brought a squad of 10 Marines with him, the remnants of a force that had started the siege with 2,000. Joe had lost friends, people he had trained with and laughed with and shared meals with. And there was a part of him that wanted to hate the Vethari for what they had done. But Danny's orders were clear, and more than that, Joe's own sense of what was right was clear. The fighting was over. These were soldiers who had been beaten, and they deserved to be treated the way Joe would want to be treated if the positions were reversed. Over 300 Vethari soldiers laid down their weapons in front of Joe and his squad. They were huge, towering over the humans, and even unarmed, they looked dangerous. But Joe could see something in their eyes that he recognized because he had felt it himself during the darkest days of the siege. They were tired, they were scared, they were just people who wanted to stop fighting. Joe offered them water. He had his medics check the wounded. He arranged for food to be brought up from the bunkers. The Vethari soldiers watched all of this, with expressions that ranged from confusion to something that might have been gratitude. Claire Sutton was still in her underground hospital when the Vethari wounded were brought down. She had been working for close to 3 weeks at that point, sleeping in short bursts on a cot next to the operating table, eating when someone put food in front of her, and running on a combination of caffeine and pure determination. She had saved more than 70 human lives during the siege, performing surgeries that would have been difficult in a proper hospital, and were nearly miraculous in an underground bunker with improvised equipment. When the first Vethari patient was carried into her hospital, Claire looked at him for a long moment. He was young, barely an adult by Vethari standards, with a wound in his side that was badly infected. His yellow eyes were wide with fear. Not fear of the humans, but fear of dying on a world far from home. Claire turned to her assistants and said 2 words, "Bring him in." She treated the Vethari wounded with the same care and attention she had given her own people. She cleaned their wounds, set their broken bones, and administered medications that she had to adjust on the fly, because Vethari biology was different from human biology in ways she was learning in real time. She made mistakes, corrected them, and kept going. A young Vethari soldier, barely old enough to hold a weapon, was lying on a cot with bandages around his chest. He watched Claire move through the hospital, treating human and Vethari patients side by side, and he asked her a question through a translation device. He asked her why she was healing the people who had tried to kill her. Claire stopped what she was doing and looked at him. She was exhausted. Her eyes were red, and her hands had not stopped shaking for days. But her voice was steady when she answered. She told him that the fight was over, and that he was just a kid who got hurt. That moment was recorded by a journalist who had been trapped in the bunkers during the siege. The image of a human medic treating alien wounded in an underground hospital, surrounded by the ruins of a colony that had been nearly destroyed, became one of the most widely shared images in galactic history. It was broadcast on communication networks across hundreds of worlds and seen by billions of beings from dozens of species. It changed things. Not immediately, and not completely, but it planted a seed. Admiral Danny Cole returned to Earth as a hero, though he did everything he could to deflect the attention. He refused most of the honors and medals that were offered to him. He told the press that the real heroes were on Kepler 22b and in the Wolfpack squadrons, the Marines and pilots and engineers and volunteers who had bled and died so that humanity could survive. He requested that every award be redirected to the people who had served under him. Nick Dunn's Wolfpack Doctrine was adopted as the standard combat strategy for the United Earth Defense Fleet. Military academies across the galaxy requested copies of his tactical papers. Several alien species sent delegations to study his methods. Nick accepted the recognition politely, and then went back to teaching at the academy on Luna, which was the only thing he had ever really wanted to do. His students said he never once bragged about the battle, though he occasionally used it as an example in class to illustrate the importance of flexibility in combat planning. Pete Garza's missile modification became one of the most significant technological breakthroughs in human military history. 17 different defense contractors offered him patents and licensing deals worth more money than most people would see in a lifetime. Pete turned them all down. He released the designs publicly and told anyone who asked that technology built to protect people should not be locked behind a paywall. He went back to Proxima and resumed building water recycling plants. Amy Voss became one of the most decorated pilots in fleet history, though she always insisted she was just a cargo runner who got lucky. She eventually accepted a teaching position at the Flight Academy, where she trained the next generation of pilots with a combination of technical skill and a philosophy she summed up in a single sentence. She told her students to fly like they had somewhere to be and someone waiting for them. Her students loved her. The Academy's accident rate dropped by 30% during her tenure. Karen Walsh was promoted to Commodore and given command of a new fast attack squadron built around the Wolfpack Doctrine. The Dawn Runner was repaired and returned to service, and Karen insisted on keeping her as her flagship despite being offered newer and larger vessels. She said the Dawn Runner had earned its place. On Kepler 22b, the colony was rebuilt. It took years. The scars of the siege were visible for a long time, in the rubble that took months to clear, in the scorched ground where buildings had once stood, in the faces of the people who had lived through it. But the colony came back, as human settlements always did, and it came back stronger. Hank Lawson retired from the Marines after the war and stayed on Kepler 22b. He said he had bled too much for that world to leave it. He opened a small workshop where he taught young colonists how to build things and fix things, and he never talked about the siege unless someone asked him directly. Joe Briggs stayed in the service. He was promoted several times and eventually became one of the highest-ranking enlisted men in the fleet. He carried the dog tags of the Marines he lost on Kepler 22b for the rest of his life. Claire Sutton was awarded the highest civilian honor Earth could give. She continued practicing medicine on Kepler 22b, and her hospital became one of the finest medical facilities in the outer colonies. She treated humans and aliens alike, and she never turned anyone away. The Vethari Dominion did not survive the war intact. Within a decade, the empire that had ruled the Orion Corridor for 6,000 years fragmented. Subject species, emboldened by humanity's example, rose up and demanded their freedom. Most of them got it. Drevik Thal disappeared from public life and was rumored to have gone into exile on a remote world at the edge of known space. The galactic community spent years trying to understand what had happened. How had a young, outnumbered, outgunned species defeated the most powerful military empire in the sector? Analysts and historians from 100 worlds studied the war, wrote papers, and debated endlessly. They looked at human technology, human tactics, human biology, and human psychology, searching for the answer. The answer was not in any of those things alone. It was in something harder to measure and impossible to replicate. It was in Danny Cole's quiet refusal to run, in Hank Lawson's defense of a world that was not worth defending by any rational calculation, in Joe Briggs fighting on after losing half his squad, in Claire Sutton healing the enemy because the fight was over, in Karen Walsh flying into certain death because someone had to, in Amy Voss flying like she had somewhere to be, in Pete Garza giving away his work because it was the right thing to do. It was in the stubborn, irrational, magnificent refusal to accept that something was impossible just because the numbers said it was. No army that faced humanity survived intact, not because humans were the strongest, or the smartest, or the most advanced, but because they simply would not stop. They adapted when the situation changed. They improvised when their tools broke. They sacrificed when sacrifice was needed. And when the fighting was done, they reached out a hand to help their enemies stand back up. That was what made them terrifying. That was what made them human. The year was 2347, and humanity had spread across 14 star systems. They had built cities on frozen moons, where temperatures dropped low enough to crack steel. They had raised domes on volcanic worlds, where the ground shook every few hours. They had even built floating stations above gas giants, places where no sane species would ever think to live. But humans were not known for being sane. They were known for being stubborn. The rest of the galaxy had noticed. Over 100 species made up the galactic community, and most of them had been traveling between stars for thousands of years before humans even learned how to make fire. To these older civilizations, humanity was a curiosity at best and a nuisance at worst. They were loud. They argued with each other constantly. They ate things that would poison most other species. And they bred fast, spreading to new worlds with a speed that made the elder races nervous. No one was more nervous than the Vethari Dominion. The Vethari were reptilian, tall, and built like war machines. They stood 7 feet on average, with thick scaled hides that could stop a knife and claws that could open a metal door. They had ruled the Orion Corridor for over 6,000 years, conquering every species they encountered and folding them into their empire. Their military was enormous. Their fleet was the largest in the sector. And their Hawk commander, a scarred old warrior named Drevik Thal, had personally overseen the subjugation of 11 species during his career. Drevigthal did not like humans. He had watched their expansion with cold yellow eyes and growing anger. Every new colony they built was an insult to the Vethari way of thinking, which held that only the strong had the right to claim territory. And humans, in Vethari eyes, were not strong. They were small, soft, and fragile. They had no claws, no armor, no natural weapons of any kind. The idea that such creatures could claim worlds that the Vethari themselves had not yet reached was something Drevik could not tolerate. He called a war council aboard his flagship, the Crushing Tide, and told his commanders that the time had come to put humanity in its place. His generals agreed without hesitation. The Vethari had never lost a war. They did not expect this one to be any different. On the other side of the neutral zone, Admiral Danny Cole was sitting in his office aboard the carrier Steadfast, reading a report about supply shortages at the Kepler-22 colony, when Lieutenant Megan Hart knocked on his door. Megan was young, sharp, and rarely showed emotion, but Danny could see something in her eyes that he did not like. She told him that a Vethari war flotilla had crossed into the neutral zone. Over 300 warships, moving in battle formation directly toward Kepler-22b. Danny set down his coffee and asked her to repeat that number. She did. 312 ships, she said, including 8 dreadnoughts, the largest class of warship the Vethari built. Each dreadnought was over 2 kilometers long and carried enough firepower to glass a planet. Danny had 14 ships under his direct command. The entire United Earth Defense Fleet, spread across all 14 systems, numbered around 200 vessels, and most of those were frigates and patrol craft, not built for a stand-up fight against dreadnoughts. He called his senior staff to the war room. Commander Sam Perry, his tactical officer, pulled up the sensor data and laid out what they were facing. Sam was a quiet man who spoke only when he had something worth saying, and what he said now was not comforting. The Vethari outnumbered them roughly 8-1 in ships. Their vessels were larger and more heavily armed. Their plasma weapons could cut through human hull plating at ranges that human guns could not even reach. And their soldiers, the Vethari shock troops, were among the most feared ground fighters in the galaxy. Sam finished his briefing and looked at Danny. Everyone in the room looked at Danny. Captain Lisa Grant, who commanded the Marine detachment aboard the Steadfast, broke the silence. Lisa was a compact woman with short dark hair and a reputation for being completely fearless. She had fought in 3 colonial skirmishes and had the scars to prove it. She leaned back in her chair, crossed her arms, and said that the Vethari had no idea what they were walking into. A few people in the room laughed, but it was the nervous kind of laughter. Danny did not laugh. He was thinking. Then Megan reported that she had intercepted a broadcast from the Vethari flagship. It was addressed to all human colonies and outposts. The message was not long. It said that humanity had 90 standard hours to withdraw from every system beyond Sol. Every colony, every outpost, every station. If humans did not comply, the Vethari would destroy them, all of them. The message ended with a phrase that Megan translated roughly as, "This is not a negotiation." Danny read the message twice. He looked around the room at his officers. These were people he trusted with his life. Sam, who could find a weakness in any battle plan. Lisa, who would charge into fire without blinking. Megan, who could keep her head when everything around her was falling apart. And dozens of others, men and women who had signed up to protect the colonies and the people who lived in them. He thought about the colonies. He thought about the families on Kepler-22b, the children on Proxima, the miners on Barnard's Reach, the researchers on Tau Ceti, millions of people who had left Earth to build new lives among the stars, people who had worked and struggled and sacrificed to turn hostile worlds into homes. He was not going to tell those people to abandon everything they had built because a reptile with a big fleet told him to. Danny composed a reply. It was short. It read, We respectfully decline. He sent it on an open channel so that every ship in both fleets could hear it. Then he turned to his officers and told them to start planning. They had 90 hours, and there was a lot of work to do. Megan asked him if he really thought they could win this fight. Danny looked at her for a long moment, and then said that he did not know if they could win. But he knew they were not going to run. Whatever happened next, they would face it standing up. The clock started ticking. Across the neutral zone, Drevik Thal received Danny's reply. He read it, and for the first time in a long career built on fear and conquest, he felt something he could not quite name. It wasn't fear, not exactly. It was more like confusion. He had given this small, soft species a chance to survive, and they had thrown it back in his face with 3 words. He turned to his war council and told them to prepare for the assault. If the humans wanted a fight, the Vithari would give them one they would never forget. What Drevik did not understand, what he could not understand, was that humans had a very long memory when it came to fights, and they had been fighting against impossible odds since long before they ever reached the stars.